I'm Dr. Jerry Dawson, professor at Duke University and one of the co-developers of ESDM. As a clinician and a neuroscientist, I've always been interested in early development of the brain and its relationship to both typical and atypical development. Now that you understand the principles and theory behind ESDM, I'm going to explain the neuroscience behind it. Over the last several years, scientists have gained a lot of knowledge about early brain development and its role in children's early learning. This has helped us understand the important role of the environment in shaping children's brain and behavioral development. The work I'll be telling you about during today's session was conducted at the University of Washington when I was a professor there. I now direct the Duke Center for Autism and Brain Development, one of the ESDM training sites. We all inherit genes from our parents, and those genes influence all aspects of our development, from our hair color to our cognitive abilities. Human beings have about 25,000 genes. We know that autism is a condition that's affected by genetics. Genes likely account for why one child with autism develops language easily, and others struggle throughout life. Genes set the stage for development, but it's early experiences that actually shape the circuits in the brain. The brain processes information by forming connections and networks between nerve cells called neurons. The connections between neurons are called synapses. A child's brain actually has about twice as many synapses as it will have in adulthood. Between birth and age 3, synapses are formed at a faster rate than at any other time. This surplus of synapses is gradually pruned. Repeated use strengthens a synapse, and those that are rarely used are eliminated. In this way, early experiences shape the circuits of the brain. Interestingly, research suggests that autism is associated with having too many synapses. This early pruning process appears to have been disrupted. Recall that I said that the brain is rapidly forming synapses during early development. Note that the rate of synapse formation is about 700 per second in the early years. This graph illustrates when certain functions of the brain develop and when they are most influenced by experience. Environment has an impact on the development of sensory systems shortly after birth. It has an impact on language and social development from birth to 6 years. Thus, this is a very important period for early intervention for young children with autism. Now, let me explain this illustration to you. We know quite a bit about how autism develops in early life. We've learned this by watching home videotapes that are made of infants who later develop autism, and also by prospectively following infants who are at risk for autism by virtue of the fact that they have an older sibling with autism. We've learned that before 6 months of age, infants who later develop autism don't show many symptoms. If symptoms are there, they're subtle, they're not obvious. Thus, the baby is interacting with the world in a relatively normal way, and the brain is getting the type of experience it expects during this time. However, between 6 and 12 months, the infant with autism begins to pay less attention to people, babbles less, and doesn't imitate other people. In other words, the baby is not socially engaged with others. This lack of social engagement means that the infant is not learning about faces, voices, gestures, and other aspects of the social world during this early developmental period. The brain is wired to expect that social and language stimulation should occur during this period. However, for an infant with autism, the parts of the brain that are important for social and language development, such as the prefrontal lobe and the temporal lobe, these are not getting the expected amount of stimulation. Synapses in those areas are not being strengthened. Instead, the infant is focusing on objects and sometimes unusual details in the environment. Areas of the brain that specialize in object-related activities, such as patterns, are being stimulated. Thus, the synapses in those areas are being strengthened. Fortunately, early intervention based on ESDM can change this pattern of development. In the next part of the lecture, I'm going to explain how ESDM is designed to promote brain development and address the specific differences in brain development that are associated with autism. The first way that ESDM promotes brain development is by teaching skills during the period when the brain usually acquires those skills and is most plastic. Now recall that I said that between birth and 6 years of age, the brain is forming synapses, and experience has its biggest impact on social and language development. The brain is primed to develop social and language skills during this time. This is the concept of neural readiness. When you teach skills, when the brain normally expects to acquire those skills, the ability to respond is more rapid and stronger. The synapses in the regions of the brain that are responsible for language and social skills have not been eliminated because of lack of use. They're there and they're ready to be strengthened. This is why outcomes for children with autism are better the earlier intervention begins, and why it takes more effort and longer when the same intervention is delivered when a child is older. I do want to make a point here, though. Although it is true that the brain is more plastic and responsive early in development, the window for plasticity in early childhood is still relatively large. Also, we're learning that even through adulthood, the brain is still able to form new synapses. So intervention at any point in development, even adulthood, is still important and helpful. But earlier is better. The second way that ESDM promotes brain development is by redirecting the child's focus of attention back to people. Now, these are clips that are taken from home videotapes that were shot during the first birthday party of infants. This is the moment when the cake is given to the baby and the family is singing happy birthday. Now, the typical 1-year-old, the one on the right, is looking at the people around him and smiling. But notice what the baby with autism is doing. That baby is more interested in the plate. So autism is associated with deficits in social attention. Researchers have used eye-tracking devices to show that infants with autism pay attention to very different things in the environment compared to typical infants. Typical infants naturally focus their attention toward people, especially their eyes. From 2 months onward, infants with autism show less and less attention to the eyes of other people. What a child pays attention to shapes brain circuitry. We demonstrated this in a research study where we observed how children with autism responded when another person became upset. In this photograph, one of my former graduate students, Jamie McPartland, has just hit his finger with a play hammer and he's pretending to cry. Now, most often, typical kids will stop playing and they'll look up at the adult who has hurt himself. The typical focus of attention is on the face of that person who's crying. Now, the little boy with autism shown in the picture is continuing to focus on the object and doesn't even pay attention to the crying adult. We measured how often and how quickly the children paid attention to the adult who was crying. And then on a separate day, we measured their brain's responses to emotional stimuli using EEG. We found a strong correlation between the children's brain responses and their tendency to pay attention to the distressed adult. Children who did not pay attention showed a much slower and weaker brain response to emotional stimuli. Now, when you learn ESDM, you will learn strategies that will naturally draw the child's attention towards you and others. You will learn how to be in the child's spotlight of attention and use the child's natural preferences and interests to draw the child's attention to your face. And eventually, the child will spontaneously look at you. The child will come to realize that people are fun and interesting. They're worth paying attention to. Once the child's attention is gained, then learning about the social world, including play, gesture, and language, can occur. This social platform also sets the stage for cognitive development, which occurs through object and other types of play with people. So to summarize, ESDM promotes brain development by addressing deficits in social attention. It teaches strategies that will increase attention to other people. This provides more opportunities to learn about faces, facial expressions, gestures, and spoken language. and it stimulates social brain circuitry and sets the stage for further learning. The third way that ESDM promotes brain development is by facilitating affective or emotional engagement. Many studies have shown that children with autism have deficits in affective engagement. For example, children with autism show fewer social smiles, that is, smiles that are combined with eye contact. Affective engagement means being mutually emotionally engaged with another person during a communicative act. It turns out that affective engagement doesn't just promote emotional development in relationships, it's also important for cognitive and language development. This was demonstrated in a landmark study by Dr. Pat Kuhl. Dr. Kuhl has spent her career understanding how infants learn language. Studies have shown that when babies are born, they're capable of perceiving all of the sounds, called phonemic contrasts, of all the languages in the world. However, over time, the infants lose this ability, and they only retain the ability to perceive the phonemes that are associated with the language to which they're exposed when they're a baby. This is one reason that we have an accent when we try to learn a new language as an adult. We actually don't perceive some of the phonemes of the new language. So Dr. Kuhl was interested in whether infants exposed to a foreign language would be able to retain their ability to perceive the phonemes that are associated with that language. So she decided to expose infants in the U.S. to Mandarin Chinese and those in China to the sounds of English. She did this in two ways. In one group, the female speakers directly engaged with the infants while they spoke to them. But in the second group, she showed the exact same female speaker doing the same thing, but on a videotape. So the infants actually heard exactly the same thing. But in one condition, they were interacting with a live person. And she found that only the infants who were interacting with a live female were able to retain the phonemes of the foreign language. Now, this study shows that it's not only what we see and hear, but also the degree to which we're emotionally engaged that is important in shaping how our brains develop and how much we learn from the environment around us. This illustration shows some of the brain regions involved in attention, memory, and emotion. The prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex are important for directing attention to a stimulus. However, it's the amygdala that attaches emotional significance to the stimulus. The degree to which a stimulus is deemed to be emotionally significant will influence whether you remember it later. The hippocampus is responsible for memory functions. For example, let's imagine that you're at a party and you're introduced to someone new. At that moment, you'll be paying attention to the person. However, whether you recall that person's name later will be influenced by how emotionally invested you are in that person. Similarly, when a child pays attention and is emotionally engaged during learning, the child is more likely to retain that information. Affect also guides attention. We look at things that we find rewarding. Children with autism initially don't find social stimuli as rewarding as a typical child does. Autism may disrupt brain circuits that are responsible for sensitivity to social reward. In summary, the third way that ESDM promotes brain development is by facilitating affective engagement. ESDM uses strategies that are designed to make social interactions more rewarding and fun. We call this finding the smile. The purpose of sensory social routines, a strategy used in ESDM, is to find activities that are fun and involve sharing positive affect between the child and the adult. These types of activities stimulate social reward brain circuitry, and they set the stage for further learning. Here's an example of a child engaged with his parent in therapy while Jamie Winter, an ESDM therapist, coaches. Notice how the parent sits directly across from the child so that she is in the child's spotlight of attention. Now notice how she's using an object that the child's interested in to bring his attention to her face. And see how they're both smiling about this interaction. you will learn many strategies that promote social attention and affective engagement. Finally, the fourth way that ESDM promotes brain development is through multimodal and multi-domain teaching. This is designed to facilitate neural connectivity between different parts of the brain. Many studies using different brain imaging techniques have shown that autism is associated with reduced neural connections between different parts of the brain. This has been shown by functional MRI, where we can see that the amygdala, which is responsible for attaching emotional significance to a stimulus, is not well connected to the parts of the brain that are responsible for processing information from the face. Dr. Mike Murrius, an assistant professor at Duke, and I conducted a study where we measured functional connectivity between different parts of the brain using EEG. The picture on the right shows connections between the frontal lobe and the other parts of the brain, including the temporal lobe and occipital lobe. The blue lines are ones where individuals with autism showed weaker connections than typical individuals. Now, why is neural connectivity so important? Complex behaviors, such as social interaction and language, require precise coordination among many different brain regions. When I'm speaking with another person, I'm using my auditory cortex to process language, while I use the region around the superior temporal sulcus to interpret that person's facial expressions. And at the same time, I'm monitoring the emotional significance using my amygdala. And then I need to use my prefrontal cortex to hold the information online over time and prepare my response. Now, if people with autism have weak, long-range connections between these different brain regions, this helps us understand why language and social skills are so difficult for them. So let's return to the parent who's interacting with their child using ESDM strategies. Rather than focusing on only one skill, such as eye contact, which might stimulate one area of the brain, she's simultaneously teaching many skills. She has multiple teaching objectives. Take a moment and write down all of the skills that this parent might be targeting during this teaching episode. This teaching episode offers many teaching opportunities, including targeting eye contact, joint attention, affective engagement, receptive language, expressive language, shapes, colors, even fine motor skills. The last part of this teaching module will review the evidence that ESDM can actually influence brain activity. After all, theory is one thing, but data are another. So in 2010, my colleagues and I at the University of Washington conducted a randomized clinical trial where we were testing the effects of ESDM with toddlers with autism. Now, in this study, 48 children who were 30 months or younger were randomized to receive 2 years of ESDM by trained therapists or treatment as usual in the community. Parents in the ESDM group were also taught to use the strategies at home. The two groups actually ended up receiving similar numbers of hours of intervention overall. At outcome, we measured children's behavior as well as their brain activity, which we measured with EEG. And we found significant improvements in children's IQ, their language, their adaptive behavior, and their social behavior. We measured children's EEG activity while they viewed photographs of women's faces and photographs of toys. In previous research in our lab, we had found that typical children show a stronger brain response when they're viewing faces than when they're viewing objects. But toddlers and preschool-age children with autism show a reverse pattern. They show greater brain activity when they're viewing objects than when they're viewing people. In the ESDM clinical trial, we compared 3 groups of children at the end of the trial when the children were 4 years old. Typical children, children who had received 2 years of ESDM, and children who had received treatment as usual in the community. And we measured 2 brainwave frequency bands called alpha and theta. Now, when the brain is more engaged and attentive, alpha power is lowered and theta power goes up. Now you can see in the graph that the typical children and the children who received ESDM showed essentially identical patterns of brain activity. Their brains were more engaged when they were viewing faces than objects. And the children in the community group showed the opposite pattern, more engaged when viewing objects than faces. This was the first demonstration that early intensive intervention based on ESDM not only influences children's behavioral outcomes, it also positively affects their brain development. It essentially normalized the atypical patterns that we associate with autism. And this is really good news. The brain is plastic in children with autism. Children with autism who made greater improvements in their social behavior actually showed more normal patterns of brain activity. We were very pleased when Time magazine recognized our work showing that ESDM can normalize children's brain activity as one of the top 10 medical breakthroughs of 2012. The goal of ESDM is to alter the trajectory of brain and behavioral development so that it is closer to that of a typical child. Each child is different, and the degree to which that gap is closed will differ. But the trajectory of brain and behavioral development will be changed for every child who receives early intervention. And this will help every child reach his or her full potential. Thanks for listening and for this opportunity to tell you about the neuroscience behind ESDM.